And there we go. So over to you. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. We just said it's dinner time, so I really appreciate you being here. And hopefully I'll get to see you as well during the discussion. And I can't see my slides at the moment.
Oh, I'll just click back into that again.
Okay. And I just want to thank you, Greg, for inviting me and for the introduction. And as Greg said, I'm going to talk about critical creative pedagogies for reimagining higher education. Next slides, please. Before I do this, I just want to give you a little bit of more background about myself and where I'm coming from this talk. So I'm an anthropologist by training, and I've been teaching in anthropology and increasingly in international development for the last 20 years in different universities in the US, in New Zealand, and now in the UK. I've been at Sussex for about 6 years. And all the programs I've been teaching in have had a really critical approach towards international development that really focused on, showing students the contradictions, the complexities, the failures of international development, showing them the colonial legacies that are informing the development enterprise, showing them kind of the shortcomings of the international development industry and how it often exacerbates inequalities. And students really appreciate this critical teaching, and they realize why it's important, because they sometimes talk about, I realized I came into this course, this program, with quite naive assumptions, sometimes a bit idealistic assumptions about, kind of wanting to change the world, eradicate poverty, help poor people. Poor people usually imagine to be kind of somewhere over there, very stereotypical Africa, and that's because it's a lot what they have been receiving from, from charities and from the media. So a real kind of appreciation for critical teaching. But at the same time, I've always had another reaction, and this is students saying, okay, I know why it's important for me to know all of this, but what do I now do with this knowledge, right? You're telling me, so I came into this course because, I want to help make the world a better place, and I thought development was the way to go. But you're telling me it's not working. Everything I thought was good is just turning out to be wrong, and I'm really becoming quite cynical, quite disillusioned, and including hopeless. And so it was quite a consistent reaction. And talking to my colleagues, I also realized that I wasn't the only one who was having these conversations with students, usually, during office hours. So I started to think, as an educator, it wasn't enough for me to just say, okay, I understand how you feel, and you'll get over it. It's part of the journey, and you'll come out on the other side. For me, that wasn't quite good enough. So I started to think, what can I do in my own classrooms to keep the critique, which is absolutely essential, but also to add something else. And for me, this was about kind of, fostering students' imagination, to go beyond the impasse that this critique sometimes created. So to kind of instill questioning, but also nurture a particular kind of hope. So that's really the point of departure for my talk, but also for the project that this talk comes out of. And if you could just change the slide, please. So as I said, I've had this reaction for quite a while, but what I decided to do is to actually kind of turn it into a proper research project at Sussex. So for 3 years, I did kind of a number of semi-structured interviews with my colleagues, with students, in addition to countless kind of informal conversations and just chats in the corridors, and again during office hours. I did a really systematic review of our teaching materials in the International Development Department to see what are we teaching, how are we teaching it. I did in-class observations in my colleagues' classrooms. And also really importantly, I used my own classroom as spaces for pedagogical experimentation. So I teach a third-year specialist module on urban futures to international development students. and I teach a master's level module on activism for social change and development, which is taken from students in the School of Global Studies where I sit, but also a number of other schools across Sussex campus. And both of these modules became really important for me to think through and to try out some of these creative teaching activities. In addition, I did research at a number of Bolivian universities because I was really interested. I thought it was really interesting to get a kind of a global South perspective on how is international development taught at universities, in this case in La Paz. But the other reason why I went to Bolivia is because I'm a trained Latin Americanist, and over again a long time I've always looked to Latin America in terms of what's happening there in terms of the politics, but also in terms of alternatives. And there's a number of different alternatives that have come out from the country. And the reason why that is important, because it really informed kind of the crux and the heart of the book, which is what I call a critical creative pedagogy. So this is kind of the pedagogy that I formulated and I developed throughout the book. And the aim of this pedagogy is for students to better understand global challenges. And in the different chapters, I talk about social and economic and ecological challenges, but to also imagine alternative responses to these challenges. And when I say alternative, I mean heterodox or non-mainstream responses. And this is where kind of learning more about what's been happening in Bolivia about things such as Bon Vivir, for example, was a really important element of the research. So the book came out with Bristol University Press late last year, and I just, again, Greg has been a fantastic supporter of the project from the beginning. I think you read the proposal and the manuscript, and it's just been, I just want to say thank you again for being so enthusiastic about it. And I also have a website, creativeuniversities.com, where there's lots more information about the book. There's a resource section. I have a blog, and I have a number of interviews with kind of creative educators on there as well. So the book and the website go together. Next slide, please. Basically, what I want to do today is go through what this critical creative pedagogy means, what are the different elements of it, and how do I, give you some examples of how I do it in my own teaching, or how, examples of how we are teaching things at Sussex, and then hopefully have a conversation with you about this and maybe learn more about your teaching. Before I do this, though, as I said, I'm an anthropologist and I teach in international development. I'm not an education person. I don't have an education background. And I think that's really important for me to point out here. So I don't extensively engage with the really rich discussions I know that exist in the education literature around many of these issues. But I did want to mention just some educators and other people who have kind of inspired me and whom I'm engaging with throughout the book. And the first one is Bell Hooks and her kind of idea that we teach our students to transgress. And for me, this is really kind of, as she says, it's a movement against and beyond boundaries. So for me, that means kind of enabling students to go beyond the limits of what is normative and acceptable, to question disciplinary, institutional, and social boundaries, kind of as a central strategy of this critical creative pedagogy. And I also fully agree with when she wrote that the classroom is the most radical space in the academy. I really do believe that through our teaching, through transformative teaching, we can make a difference as academics. The other person, probably not surprisingly, is Paulo Freire. And when I say critical creative pedagogy, the critical element is really engaging with critical pedagogies and a number of different writers. But what I found so inspiring about Freire was his thoughts on the pedagogies of hope, right? So when he kind of rewrote Pedagogies of the Oppressed as Pedagogy of Hope in 1992, and really centralized the importance of hope as what you call an ontological need, but also an absolutely prerequisite for struggle that really resonated with me. And Freire talks about critical hope, which is an element of critical creative pedagogy, which I will talk about in a second. The other thing that Freire, I think, reminds all of us as educators of, that it takes courage to teach, according to our beliefs, and persistence. And he talks about, trying and trying and trying again in the classroom. And I think, again, that's a really important reminder of the kind of labor, emotional and intellectual, that's involved in this kind of teaching. Then Gibson Graham, then they're not educators. They are, there's actually two people, a kind of critical human geographers. And they talk a lot about kind of diverse economies, which is something I engage in my economics chapter. But more broadly, Gibson Graham have written quite a bit around how we can become academic subjects of possibility. And I found their writing really empowering. So they talk about academics as world makers who have a constitutive role in the world that exists and power to bring new worlds into being. But they also say that as academics, we are trained to, and I'm quoting here, we are trained to be discerning, detached, and critical, so that we can penetrate the veil of common understanding and explore the root causes and bottom lines that govern the phenomenal world. This academic stance means that most theorizing is tinged with skepticism and negativity, not a particularly nurturing environment for hopeful, inchoate experiments. And for me, this rang really true. And what Gibson Graham are talking about, we need a different kind of theory if we want to kind of create spaces in which experiments and in which alternatives can take root and germinate and grow. They call it weak theory, and I didn't particularly like the connotations of weak theory, so I've kind of taken their idea and reformulated in the book as a kind of a generative theory. So very much theorizing with the objective to generate possibilities. And it's about theory that is initially kind of more descriptive rather than analyzing everything out of existence from the get-go, saying that it's always already tainted because it is of its association with capitalism or neoliberalism. Gibson Graham saying, with that particular attitude, we will not be able to create any kind of possibilities. We need to kind of step back from that kind of theorizing towards a more generative theorizing. Then Sarah Amsler and Carrie Faze's work, some of you might be familiar with their writing on kind of, regimes of anticipation and really thinking of futurity and the role of universities in creating the futures. And that's been a really important influence. But also Sarah Amsler's idea that it's okay to dream in steps rather than leaps. And that's very much the theme of the book, which I've written in a way. So each chapter is kind of a combination of theory, where I talk about the mainstream approaches to particular subjects that we need to move beyond. And then lots and lots of examples of teaching at Sussex and in my own classrooms. But it's all quite modest and quite humble in the sense of these are all activities that have been tried out already. And I think for me, it's important to kind of start small and find the cracks and work in them, and from them growing things. So this idea of dreaming in steps really resonated. And then last but not least, I also want to acknowledge Arturo Escobar's work. He is an anthropologist from Colombia, and he has written a lot on creating alternatives, the pluriversal politics, and my ideas of what alternatives mean and how we can move to them have been really influenced by his work as well. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea of the theoretical framework that I'm drawing on. And then on the next slide, please. I also just wanted to unpack a little bit of what I mean by academic creativity. And the work of Ken Robinson, obviously important here, and his definition of creativity as the ability to leap out of familiar habits into new idea spaces. So putting things together in new ways, or putting things together that don't really belong together. And I have this, this picture here that I'm sure many of you have seen, and I know it's a really simplified representation of, the right brain and the left brain, analytical and critical. But I do think it helps us to think about it. And I sometimes really feel myself, I want to shift students out of the analytical part of their brain, where they just kind of thinking and deconstructing and then trying to find, where they can critique a particular piece of writing or something, and move them to the other part where I say, just suspend that disbelief and just try things out, and don't question, and just open yourself up to the possibility. And I'll show you examples of how I do this. So in a way, even though this representation is a simplification, I still find it quite helpful. And it's not easy, right? Because as Robinson says, when you think about how school children or how children move to the education system, and in the UK, I have two boys. One of them is sitting GCSEs, and one of them is doing A levels this year, and it's just it's just really awful watching them prepare. That's all I'm going to say about this. So I really can relate to what Robinson talks about, this academicism and the way that it just, really works against nurturing creativity in school students. So when they come to university, it's almost like we have to re-engage that process. I also like Alison James and Stephen Brockfield's work they talk about academic imagination and kind of their definition of, moving away from the well-trodden to sniff out the subtle indicators of possibility and to move sideways and beyond. Again, I thought that was a wonderful description of what we can try and do in the classroom to get students into more creative spaces. Now, the interesting thing is they also say that we have to be really careful, because if students feel that they are not creative or transformational enough in their learning, then this kind of teaching can become another form of control or a form of disciplinary power. And for me, it's really important to be really explicit about the kind of, the normative values that are part of a project like this, and saying, yes, there is an agenda. Having said this, I believe in terms of creativity in the idea that every individual has creative potentials, right? They might be more latent in some students and educators than in others. And it is up to us to create the spaces in the classroom that are inviting, that are flexible, that are open for students to feel comfortable enough to move into that kind of this more creative sphere, while at the same time, being really careful in how we present this. What I'm not talking about, and again, I just want to mention this here, it's not what Rob Pope has called corporate managerialist creativity, because I know a lot of universities, when they think about creativity, they, attach it to kind of employability agendas and really kind of normative, market-driven and employment-driven programs. And Pope is really good. He kind of talks about this corporate managerialist creativity as emerging during the mid-20th century as a particular Euro-American response to problems associated with rapid social and technological change, and aimed to bring about scientific discovery, technological inventions, commercial competition, and military superiority. So it focuses on creativity as a tool for corporate growth and national economic competitiveness. And he actually calls it one of the most prized commodities of capitalism. So this is not the kind of creativity I'm talking about. I'm more with Sarah Amschler, who talks about kind of a radical creativity. And then last but not least, for me, creativity and critique are not separate. They are actually situated on a continuum. And as Robinson says, right, every act of creativity at some point necessitates critique, because we need to step back from our creations, from our imaginations, and see, are they of value? Are they offering something unique? What's kind of creative about them? So, I'm not talking about a creativity that's completely disconnected from critique, but it's more about complementing critique and creativity rather than displacing it. So that's kind of a little bit of the theory and where I'm coming from. And I think now I want to move on to this critical creative pedagogy and give you an idea of what it looks like, and then share some examples with you. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. So here, as you can see, it's a visual representation. I call it kind of the guiding star or the flower of critical creativity, and that was created by Paul Brand. And you can see, so the main thing to focus on at the moment is these four strands, these four petals: whole person learning, design and arts, praxis, and critical hope. And I'm going to kind of move through them one by one. So if we go to the next slide, I want to start off with whole person learning, which again is a term I actually borrow from Alison James and Stephen Brockfield, who talk about whole person learning in their own writings. And it's really something quite foundational that I think we all know, but sometimes forget, that when students come into our classrooms, they're not just kind of their intellects or their brains, but they are, you know, people they bring their bodies, their emotions, their senses into the classroom. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and to create classroom spaces where students feel safe to do that. But for me, it's also about really acknowledging students' own experiences as really important sources of knowledge in the classroom, and saying, you know, how you are in the world, how you perceive the world, and what you know about the world, share this in the classroom with your fellow students, with me, because there's really important knowledge in there that we can use and that we can learn from each other. And some of the examples I talk about in the book is body mapping. One of my colleagues uses body mapping in a class on gender, when she kind of explores issues of power, and using the body to think through, you know, how our feet are grounding us in the world, and how our hands, you know, might be extending us to other people, and what we hold in our hearts, in our heads. Body mapping is also a really creative activity, because it's about drawing an outline of the body and then filling it in with different colors and drawings and slogans. Another activity I write about is serious games, which one of my colleagues uses in a class to teach students about climate change uncertainty. And again, it's a really embodied form of learning that often involves students, you know, doing physical activities, moving their bodies through the room, jumping around, or, you know, I can talk more about this in the question and answers if you're interested. But again, it's a really experiential and embodied form of learning. So in my own classes, and particularly in the module on urban futures, I actually I ask students to apply quite a bit of their learning to Brighton. The Sussex campus is located in close proximity to Brighton, and by the third year, most students live in Brighton. They move out of the halls in their second year. So by the third year, they knew Brighton really well. And it gives us a fantastic opportunity to think about what does urban futures mean in a really concrete context. And one of the activities the students do is jointly write a Brighton manifesto to think about how can Brighton be made a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable city. But before they do this, I ask them to keep at the beginning of the term, actually, a Brighton diary for a week, where I say, you know, become much more conscious of how you are as a Brighton resident. So, you know, map where you go, who you interact with, where you do your shopping, map how you feel about particular spaces, and then bring that in the classroom. And on the basis of that experiential knowledge, start talking about how things could be improved. And you know, when I first taught this class in 2019, I asked students to kind of build an artifact or, you know, write a poem or something and share that in the class. And then I taught the class the next time in the spring of 2020 during lockdown. And I just realized that I really had to acknowledge the impact that COVID had on students' lives. Some of them were still in Brighton, some of them had moved out of Brighton, but obviously a really different relationship to the city. So when I set up a Padlet, and I said to students to kind of share their experiences virtually, but I also invited them to talk about what is it they were missing, what was it they were mourning, what were they reminiscing about to their pre-COVID lives. And the Padlet, which is here, and it's also on my website in a blog post, and I'm sharing that with permission of the students, became an absolutely incredible space of students uploading photos and saying, I miss birthday parties and just going to the pub with my friends and going to events. But also, on the other hand, students also talking about discovering nature more and connecting more with the beach. So it became a space of both mourning, but also kind of celebrating other things. And for me, that's a really good example of whole person learning. And then we use that to write this Brighton manifesto. And that relates directly to the next strand. If we could have the next slide, please, which is the use of design and arts methods in the classroom. And especially design, and I'm have been interested in the use of design for development for a number of years and have kind of researched it and written about this. But in terms of teaching, for social science teaching, I think there's particular concepts and particular methods that from design that really lend themselves to critical creative teaching. And an example here is, for example, this idea of wicked problems. So reformulating global challenges as wicked problems that are complex and that are interconnected and that have lots of different stakeholders and that don't have any real solutions and have lots of unintended consequences. So giving students that kind of concept to understand global challenges has been really good. Design also has particular ways to develop students' capacity to imagine things, to experiment, but also to empathize with others, and the ability to ask open-ended questions and to be comfortable with ambiguity, right, where there are more than two answers to a particular question, and the absence of any easy or indeed any solutions to some of these challenges. I think all of these are particular orientations that students, that we can help students develop. And I think there is something in particular design methods, but also the creativity of arts that we can use here. And the other thing I really like about the design of the arts, that it reminds us of the materiality of teaching, right? And so often when we do seminar discussions, it's the students and the screen. I mean, it's often not even paper anymore because everything is now consumed through the screen. And that's a really kind of one-dimensional form of engaging with knowledge. So by bringing in these materials, and the example I have here is when the students write this manifesto, I then have a class where they actually build it. And it's this idea of building scenarios of Brighton 2050. What do you want it to look like? And how would you, again, to begin to create this? And I bring in all these, wooden blocks and Legos and pipe cleaners and Play-Doh and all those things that we know about. And students build, and sometimes it takes them a while to get into it, but they usually do, and they have wonderful creations. But it also links back to whole person teaching, because so often I get the reaction when they open a can of Play-Doh and that smell comes out and say, oh my God, this reminds me of my childhood. And of course, childhood often a period of creativity. So again, connects back to whole person learning. And that can be fostered through the use of design and arts methods. Next slide, please. Yes, so then we move on to the third strand, which is praxis, coming from Paulo Freire, practice informed by theory, reflection, and dialogue. And that's really important in ID, because I talked about, sometimes that kind of that naivete that some students come into the program with. So I'm not talking about saviorism or white saviorism, where I'm saying, students, you have the answer to the problems and you have the solution. I don't talk about solutions at all. I talk about kind of responses to challenges. But I do think that, using applied learning or problem-focused learning, or I think of it as learning by doing. And I was actually just in a workshop last week where somebody said learning by doing together, which I actually really, really liked. There's a lot of potential in, applying theoretical concepts and theoretical knowledge to particular challenges. So the example I have here in my Urban Futures class, we have a class on infrastructures where we, unpack infrastructure as socio-technical assemblages. We talk about the materiality and the visibility and the invisibility. We talk about the colonial approaches to infrastructure, so a really theoretical approach. But then I turn campus into a mini city, and I divide students into groups and ask them to research a particular infrastructure. And then we do a walking seminar across campus, and they map where they see those infrastructures, and they answer questions about, what is the state of the infrastructure, how do human users engage with it, but also how does it sit within the surrounding ecosystem. And then the students come into class and they develop a presentation sharing what they found, but also kind of forward looking. How can the infrastructures be more sustainable? And then they present this to the rest of the class, and we kind of role play kind of a hypothetical senior management team. So for me, this is one of example of using theoretical knowledge and applying it to, again, a concrete context where students often saying, my God, I've never been aware that we have these ponds in the middle of campus, or I've never thought of campus as a learning space in this way. So again, it's opening up students' ideas of where learning takes place. And then the last strand, next slide, please, is again, definitely last but not least, is this idea of critical hope that I mentioned before, where I think it is important to nurture hope in our students, or to keep their hope alive, but not in kind of a naive or fantasy way or wishful thinking kind of a way, but a hope that is aware, that is reflexive, so it's always interrogating itself, that is reparative in terms of looking backwards and addressing past injustices, but is also active and forward-looking. And in my classes, for example, on the activism module I teach, we talk a lot about prefiguration, right? Which is the idea of creating the change you want to see in the world, in the here and now. And in the book, I talk about, teach outs that are taking place, every time we go on strike, which we have been doing a lot recently. I talk about students' initiatives to decolonize the curriculum and to co-create curriculum. All of these, I think, are prefigurative actions by students to model a kind of teaching that they want to see. And in my course specifically, the students actually, again, work in groups and spend half of the module designing an activism campaign on an issue they want to address. They pick the issue, and then again, they use the theoretical knowledge from the first part of the module and a number of tools I introduced them to design these campaigns. And then just finishing off, the other question was, how do students take their knowledge outside the classroom, right? If we want to think about addressing global challenges. And here I had some really, really interesting interviews with Sussex students who were involved in the climate strikes, who actually organized the big Brighton climate strikes in the autumn of 2019. And it was framed through the issue of climate justice. And again, that was something that came out of their teaching, the critical teaching they had received. So again, for me, a really good example of critical hope and the connection between the classroom and the outside world. So just to wrap up here, next slide, please. Coming back to this flower, or this guiding star, whole person learning, design and arts praxis. And this is really very flexible, right? We don't have to start with whole person learning. I think of this as a tool that educators can use and really adjust whatever way they want. If they want to start with another pedal, or if they want to rearrange that, that's absolutely possible. And it's also, I have this particular tool. I also think of this critical creative pedagogy as something that can be as small or as large as one wants it to be, right? So there's a lot of flexibility in using the concepts, but also the examples. And the book is really written as kind of an invitation to try things out in the classroom. And I think that's the end of my presentation. I've talked for long enough. So I think on the next slide, there is just, if there's any questions, and then if you want to get in touch, and just the website, and I'm also on Twitter. Thank you so much for listening.
Excellent. Fabulous stuff again, Anke. Right. Unfortunately, because I was doing the slides, I've not managed to keep track of the comments that were coming through, the chats. So as per usual, I've got questions, but I don't want to just kind of hijack the environment. So I want to offer it out to colleagues. Any kind of questions, comments, thoughts? Who wants to go first? Okay, well, I'll leap in then. Right. So my question, all of the kind of techniques that you mentioned, such as body mapping and that kind of prompts a range of other thoughts and experiments that I want to kind of develop and try out. But whenever I try anything different that's based on kind of experimentation or risk, where students are concerned, I tend to get a bit of resistance from the students themselves. Which takes a bit of navigating. So how do you navigate that? How do you nurture the students from the point of almost kind of a didactic reliance to risk and expect? How do you do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it starts off by really explaining why I'm doing what I'm doing. And this is not just for the sake of, being creative, but there's pedagogical thinking behind why I'm introducing a particular exercise. And also in my modules, it's quite gradual. So for example, I don't do body mapping because I don't feel I have the ability to really hold that space. But my colleague who does it has a particular training and has lots of experience with it. I know educators who do kind of meditation with their students. Again, I don't have that background, that training. So I have to be comfortable with it. I have to be able to explain it to the students. But I usually develop these exercises quite gradually, and they are getting bigger over the course of the term. So I know students are more comfortable with it. They feel like they can do this now because we've done this exercise before. But also, I think that flexibility, also saying if somebody is really uncomfortable, having another option or something, and often when the class starts engaging, then everybody gets pulled in. But I know exactly that feeling, like early on. But it's also often about just setting up the room, having the materials there, having music playing. So they're coming in and it's like, ooh, we're doing something different today. So creating that expectation, but also the environment from the beginning where students feel like, and they usually get quite excited and it's like, ooh, it's different. That's, yeah. But I know what you mean.
Yeah, it is a strange one because the way that I kind of because I invite students to kind of think about autoethnographic writing and kind of base on the kind of the previous experiences and a lot of the theories that you make reference to. So I utilize elements of those as well. But not all students feel particularly comfortable. Certainly at the commencement of a module in thinking, well, you want me to write about myself? I'm not comfortable. So the way I kind of pitch that is as an invitation.
Yeah.
So I'm inviting you to think about, you don't have to, and then in kind of framing it in those terms as the module progresses, they do start to kind of feel more comfortable with it. And by the time they get towards the end of the module, the kind of the student stories that emerge are fabulous. Really different and kind of memorable stuff.
Yeah. I remember reading in your book also, because also for you, these are also some assessed activities. And I think it's important to make a difference between just having non-assessed activities that are kind of smaller and maybe more informal, and then assessed activities. So most of mine are non-assessed, but for example, the activism campaigns, they are assessed, but that's because they do a substantial part of the term, they work on them and they have a lot of guidance. But again, there you also have to, there's a lot of anxiety. I've never done something like this, am I going to do well? So acknowledging that, and again, bringing them along, it's a journey.
Yeah.
Some of the bigger creative projects, definitely.
Yeah, because I've got an MA module that's just coming to the end now. So the students have gone through the kind of the painful process, so to speak. But then one of the questions that emerged this week to me, because they're based on really quite personal and personalized stories, how are you going to mark this? How are you going to allocate a grade? Which is, to be perfectly honest, it is very problematic. So I kind of explained to them, I'm not going to attempt to attach a grade or a value judgment on their personal stories, because that would be insulting.
Yeah.
So it's more a kind of an assessment of how they've engaged with theory and concept and built that into their stories, and how effective that they've kind of adapted that, and that kind of seems to work. Right, so I'm just conscious I don't want it to be kind of the Craig show. We've got a lot of colleagues here tonight. Any other questions or anything that you want to kind of focus in on?
Can I just say something, Craig? Haley?
Yes. Yeah.
No, I just, obviously I'm not at the caliber of, professorships and things like that. I've only done a little bit of teaching only in schools as well. But I think, again, what you're just saying there, it's perseverance. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you disappeared there a second, Haley. What?
Sorry. No, I was saying before you get to the nitty-gritty of teaching, I think you have to get to grips with your students, and whether it takes half a term you will eventually get there. And I've found that myself. I mean, what you were just saying about us all being all uptight, and I'm not writing in the first person and I'm not doing it is strange when you have that thing in your head that university is a structured concept, and you are going to come out with this grade, that grade, whatever. But I with my own students, when I was in teaching in schools, I just went against the grain totally, and I did all sorts of things. And I was teaching citizenship, so one of my things was I started off with the Johari window. I don't know whether you've ever heard of that.
No.
And it was getting the students to think about their language and how they were treating other students in the class. And when we got that sort of, oh wow, you thought that about me, and this is how I thought about you, it was brilliant. And it sort of opened up then channels for discussion. It was really, really good. So it takes perseverance, going, like you always say about this, being hopeful and working out of that box and bringing things in that the head didn't know about. I had to do it sort of like as a starter or a plenary. It was like I had to put it on a lesson plan, but it didn't always sort of go to plan. But it's that, yeah, it does come. And we're all, like I say, we just got this social sort of construct around us of and it's hard to break those walls and barriers down. Just very, very difficult. However, again, with age as well, I mean, I wish I could do my BA again. I wish I could do my MA again, and I wish I could do it all differently, because as you more little evenings like this with seminars, things are starting to click and it's lovely. And I'm just sort of, yeah, but that's all I need to say. I'll carry on doing these seminars because I'm still learning.
Excellent.
It can all be taken into the classroom, so all of it. So.
Well, that's one thing that I find particularly impressive, because you've mentioned this to me before, that you've kind of attempted some of this experimental stuff in a school context, which for me, I think is absolutely fantastic.
I say it's difficult, however, if you persevere, and then, like I say, it's one of those, like we're going back to this lockdown thing and getting your own children maybe in a way to see things differently. Like my daughter did a photography course and it was during lockdown, but going out there doing a diary of how she was seeing Darwin at the time, amazing. She's saying, oh, why can't the streets be empty more often? Because you start seeing things around you that you don't notice usually because people are there and they're hiding everything, and you're not, and it's just all these different ways of learning. Just I wish people wouldn't see them as barriers sometimes, and it's just very frustrating because we don't learn. We are hands-on. We are, let's get the Play-Doh out of the tubs. Let's make our own Play-Doh. Don't let them buy it. Make it. So easy. But it needs to be different. So totally different. I say I'm not I'm not an academic. I'm learning for myself progression, myself sort of like, I don't even actually want to work in a classroom at the moment because it's put me off. However, yeah, that's just my little point of view.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Right, we've got a couple of hands raised. So Avril, you seem to be the first. So Avril, what's your question?
Oh, hi. I'm not sure whether it's a question as much as an observation in the same way as Hayley, really, to a certain extent. I just want to start by saying thank you, Anke. That was fascinating. And everything you said rang true. It was just, it feels like a quest that you're on. And sometimes you feel like you might be one of the few people doing it because everybody else. I mean, I teach on the primary education programs at John Moores. And we're basically doing teacher training, and quite a lot of my modules focus on creativity in one way or another. And as part of that, I'm trying to encourage our primary trainees to be creative and to explore their own creativity and actually understand the difference between being creative and presenting something to the children creatively. And sort of teaching for creativity as well. And what I'm finding is that process with the students is actually becoming more difficult each year because the students seem to be becoming less creative themselves in terms of their thinking. And we put it in another way, and I say to them, looking at the Anna Craft work around possibility thinking, and I say to them, think of creativity like that, not as something where you're just good at art or you're just good at music or whatever, and they really, really struggle with it. But I think their struggle is getting worse because education is becoming so driven by the targets and the catch-up curriculum, and all that creativity is being lost. And within that, I think, and sorry, I'm going on a bit. I'm on a soapbox now. But within that, I think they've lost their ability to be critical about things. And I would just wonder what your experiences are of kind of trying to encourage that a bit more.
Which one, the critical bit or the creative bit?
A bit of both, really, but yeah, critical, definitely. They really struggle between the difference between being critical and criticizing, and they don't really get that. They just want to kind of rip something to shreds, but they don't understand that idea of being critical. But also the creativity. It's how do you do that? How do you encourage that with them?
Yeah, no, I've noticed this as well, and I think it takes a lot of explaining that being critical doesn't mean to try and find fault and criticize things, and sometimes the students, when sometimes when you want to just talk about possibilities and things that are happening, it's the students who come back and saying, well, but there's an issue with this and there's an issue with that, so they reflect the critical teaching back to us, which I always find really interesting. When then I'm saying, yeah, you're right, but let's just open up this space a little bit and step outside of that critical thinking. And what if we looked at it from this side? So I work a lot with questions. I feel like posing questions, in design, it's like the what if questions, the how might we questions. And really open-ended, and sometimes breaking it down into smaller and smaller questions, and often just putting it back to the students when they're kind of saying something or asking something. And it takes patience and practice. And I think there's a reason why I only wrote this book after 15 years of teaching, because it's taking me that long to both figure it out, but also to have the confidence to put this out there, right? Because as I said, I'm not an education person, and anthropologists and development scholars don't usually write about their own teaching. We write about the other research we do. So it's definitely been a journey, and the book is almost written like a journey. But I think, you know, persevering, and for me, because I think it's important, I try and find these workarounds, but kind of care. And I think what Greg was saying, you know, really providing an inviting rather than an imposing environment, and really saying, you know, I would like you to try this, and this is why I would like you to try this. And if it doesn't work, let's take a different approach. And I mean, there are sometimes sessions where I feel like that just go down like a lead balloon, that didn't work at all. And then, you know, then I think about what was going on here, and then I'll try again next year.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a fantastic observation, and good question. And yeah, I wish you kind of, you know, stick with the creativity bit, even if it's hard.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it is definitely called for.
Excellent, thanks. I think, you know, that is a key point. You know, on your part, which again is something that resonates with me, the willingness to kind of experiment. And if it goes wrong, you kind of, you know, don't panic, just kind of let it go wrong, reflect on it, and then try something different. Anyway, so we have another question from Lisa Kelly. So Lisa, what's your question?
So I come from a bit of a different background, and I come from HE, where we were teaching a mixture of adults. I was teaching in an FE environment. So obviously we kind of had the resilience that I think, you know, a few people have referred to from our adult students, where they want to come in, get their learning done, and go home and feed their kids and go to work and do their own thing. So we had that aspect. But obviously, because of the way that FE colleges are kind of under the thumb a little bit in terms of how they're controlled and managed and organised, and how much scrutiny they're often under, they also kind of get the pressure from the other side of things as well. And we're in sort of this more outcome oriented situation these days. And I just wondered what you thought the challenges were for creativity in teaching when you're under this outcome oriented sort of pressurized approach, where the lecturers themselves are under that pressure to produce an outcome.
Yeah, oh, that's such an important issue. And I think I'm really lucky, because I think at Sussex, and I think it might be a little bit more in other universities as opposed to further education, where especially in our own specialist modules, we have a lot of freedom, right? We have kind of basic learning outcomes, which we can even write ourselves as long as they match up to the level. But within that, there's a lot we can do, and, you know, to get a module approved is not that much paperwork. So how you do it in an environment that's much more constrained, and maybe also much more oversight. That's, I probably don't have a perfect answer to that, but kind of starting small, you know, and I always kind of think of, even if it's just a 10 or 15 minute exercise, and even there, I know sometimes it's a challenge to find those 10 or 15 minutes if a lesson plan is really full, and then if you have to get through those points. But also sometimes thinking about how can, you know, a bit of a lecture on something maybe be reframed as a more creative exercise. So how can you maybe take particular course content and present that in a different way, and maybe turn it into a group exercise where the students would maybe apply it to something, you know. But that's, I think, maybe coming back to this, you know, dreaming in steps rather than leaps. I think even small exercises, even like 10 minutes, because it's preparing the ground and getting students comfortable with that. But I think the other thing you're talking about, what if you teach in an environment where that kind of teaching is really not welcomed by line managers or by senior management? Again, what I'm doing is, you know, people in my school know about it and they're really supportive, but it's flying kind of under the radar screen of the uni as such. And I said, I have a lot of freedom. So in terms of how you navigate your own institution with that, I don't actually know. I think Sarah Amsler, do you know Sarah Amsler's work?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I turned my mic
Yeah,
off.
so I think she's written a bit about, adult education and really looking at alternatives and what we can learn from some of the more much more experimental ways of teaching. So but I'm sorry, I don't have the answer.
No, I think it's more a question I'm asking theoretically, because I've actually left that side of things behind now. But it's just really interesting because there was a talk last year, and it was Peter Schuke who was talking, and he was talking about doing things from grassroots up and kind of transforming from the bottom up. And it's actually instinctively, you've obviously taken a similar approach without necessarily doing it for the political reasoning and stuff. And it was just I was interested to see the comparison, which is clearly there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Haley's just written a comment in the chat saying, "Do it in secret. What the hierarchy don't know won't hurt them." Lol. And I do agree with that. It's better for me. It's better to ask for forgiveness and permission, because you'll never get permission. So just do it. That's my take on things. Anyway, we're almost at time, so we've probably got time for one last question. Anybody want to ask a question? Yeah, Anne-Marie. Yeah.
Dead quick. I'm really intrigued by a walking seminar that you mentioned. Have you got any top tips of how we could incorporate something like that into a standard session? I love the idea.
So the top tip is to give really good guidance, so the students don't be off. Especially in my case, they did it themselves. I didn't go with them. So they knew when they had to be back in the classroom, and they had a sheet where they had to answer questions and write down the answers. So to keep them on track, they were mapping their route, so I could kind of see. So it really making sure this is not an opportunity to go off and just chat about anything, but saying this is part of your learning. And so for me, it was I was getting students outside the classroom, which obviously some subjects, for some that is easier than others. But also, again, showing them why am I asking you to walk across campus and map this. But I found like the really good guidance. So then they come back and then again have this period where they work together, they reflect on it, they prepare presentations, always kind of have that follow-up. I think that's the other thing with creative exercises, always having time for a debrief, ideally a collective debrief where everybody can share their experiences, and drawing out the learning, because sometimes it could stay quite implicit if we don't do that. And again, the time crunch, I sometimes run out of time, and then I write emails and saying, oh, what did you think? And and students saying, I've never thought of learning outside, but it's actually a really different way. And when we all know when we walk, we kind of engage differently with thinking.
Because I've heard a lot about walking interviews, to interview people while you're walking. So I wondered if you were interacting with the students as they walked, or they were just going off with a task and walking and coming back.
Yeah, so in the class it's with the task and walking, but I've also done kind of walks across campus more informally and talk to students about in my activism class I've done that was kind of more informally. But it's a different kind of relating, walking alongside somebody is really different than sitting across from them in a class.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So Philippe has just kind of snuck in a hand at the end. Are you okay to take a final question?
It's just a comment on the idea of Anne-Marie and Anke, is that I once did a sort of maze of sorts on the floor before a test, and asked the students if they wanted to walk the walk. I mean, it had a beginning and ending, a little bit of cycle, going around and stuff, in a slow pace. So I was the first one, and I set the pace, and very slowly we walk, and then we came back to the class. This was in university, so it's not for children's, just for children's, although it works. And it was very useful. And at the end of the semester, some of the students remembered it and put it in the evaluation and said, like, I really like that idea. It was it wasn't a stressful thing, the test that they had to do, but they are always stressed about everything. So
yeah,
it it kind of reminds me that idea. I think it's kind of a merge of the ideas.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Right, time has gotten the better of us, so we need to bring things to a close there. So I just want to thank everybody for your time and your attendance and your questions, but certainly primarily I want to thank Anke for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you for having me.
And again, you as previously, you kind of get those creative juices flowing. So a lot of ideas are now revitalized. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me. Thank you for all your questions and comments. And please do get in touch over email if you want to kind of keep exploring those things.
Excellent. Thanks.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
See ya.